Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of Innovation Deciphered. Today, I'm joined by James Stuart of Galliford Try, and we're talking about his early career or earlier part of his career in Vinci, where he was on a very interesting project in Nottingham. But the bulk of our talk today will be about his work at Galliford Try, and in particular, the implementation of a innovative improvement to the lifting procedures. So, hope you enjoy the next episode. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining.
No problem.
So, James, just give me a little bit of background. I know before you joined Galliford Try, which we'll come to in a minute, you worked for Vinci,
I did, yes.
and you're on a very, well, I'll say interesting, difficult, should we say, project, which was Nottingham Tram.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a few reflections on your experiences on that project? Because it's one of those, it's a legendary, isn't it now?
Yeah, yeah. It was an interesting job to be involved in. Creation of two new lines in Nottingham. Design and build job. There's a lot of press coverage of it out there, so people can sort of pick up the ins and outs of it. But yeah, it was an interesting scheme to be involved in. A lot of engineering, a lot of good engineering on there. A lot of lessons about sort of structure of jobs in terms of making sure you've got the right resources, the right materials, the right delivery strategy, logistics, traffic management. So yeah, it was a really sort of interesting project. Difficult, very challenging. It was a design and build job. Very contractual in terms of the sort of finances behind it. Very political as well, with the client and the joint venture that we were involved with. A lot of ways to not do a project, I think, so you can learn lessons in positive ways and negative ways of things that you picked up on that were really good ideas to sort of take forward. But unfortunately, there's also ways of perhaps not doing those sort of things again. So yeah, learned a lot on that scheme. I think it aged me quite a bit as well. But yeah, it was a really interesting scheme to be involved with.
Yeah, I know, because I mean, back in the day, I had a minor part to play uh, before the job was won.
Yeah.
Uh, Probably leave that for another podcast because there's a very interesting story to tell about the genesis of
Mm-hmm.
problem projects.
Yeah.
But anyway, it sounds, I mean, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, doesn't it?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So after Vinci, you went to Galliford. Just tell me a little bit about when you joined Galliford, what your role was, what projects you were involved with.
So I joined Galliford Try just over 7 years ago now as a sub agent in what was the Highways division that's now been recently rebranded as the Infrastructure division. Been involved in all highway schemes that I've been involved with Galliford. Started off as a reasonably sort of smallish job, £3 million worth of work for VIA, so Nottingham City Council. Small access road with a small bridge. Moved up to the rugby radio scheme, which we'll talk about shortly, and recently delivered a new junction on the A1 at Grantham, which again features in. We'll talk about that later on as well. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff that we're doing at the moment. It's a really exciting time to be part of Galliford Try.
And of course, Galliford Try is run by an old colleague of mine, Bill Hocking, and I mean, it's growing quite significantly, isn't it?
It is. It is. Yeah, we've recently, as I say, we've had the rebranding for the highways into infrastructure. To reflect the sort of changing world that we're looking at, more public realm stuff, potentially more light rail, that we're looking at as well. We've recently restructured as well into a third division of major projects to reflect a couple of bigger schemes we've just picked up on.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot going on. Really good time to be.
And there's a couple of acquisitions. There was Morrison's, and there was another one recently, which was it healthcare? I forget.
Yeah, I think yes, there was. Yeah, and recently to that as well was an acquisition into the water division as well.
Water,
So
that's right,
that's going really strongly as well. Yeah,
So all sounds like exciting stuff.
it is. It is. Yeah, definitely exciting stuff. Yeah, time to be part of.
Good. So the podcast is called Innovation Deciphered, and you've got an innovation that Galliford has developed over the past couple of years. What was the, before we get into the detail of the innovation, what was the spark? What was the, what made it an imperative to do this innovation?
So we had a tragic incident a few years back on a scheme involving bridge beam lift, where unfortunately someone sustained fatal injuries. So we obviously had to react to that, and the idea behind the innovation is to get sort of people away from, specifically in this case, in the examples that we'll go through is bridge beam lifting, to make sure that people are away from the beams when they're being landed. So that was the kind of driver behind where we've got to.
And how, we're interested in the process of innovation.
Yeah.
So just talk me through, okay, there's been this tragic incident. Then what happened in terms of this innovation?
So I was involved in the scheme at Rugby, which was a new link road, and we had a bridge over the Oxford Canal, which was roughly 30-metre span bridge. It was on a cant and a skew as well, so it was quite an interesting structure. And we had bridge beams that weighed in excess of, the edge beams were 105 tonnes each, and the centre beams were 55 tonnes apiece, about a metre high, 750 wide. So because of that tragic incident we'd had, we were the first ones to sort of go again after that to lift bridge beams. So we'd obviously recognised that we were going to be sort of very, very focused on. So that was a key part of the delivery of that scheme, was to make sure that piece of work obviously went well. So we started looking with our internal temporary works teams as to how we can make sure that the beams are stable, to make sure that when we're actually planning it with obviously the lift plan, we're getting everything as well planned as we can. And then that developed a design responsibility matrix, which forms part of what we call the exceptional lift procedure. And it's actually quite straightforward, really, in terms of it's just a document that plans out exactly who needs to be doing what at what time. And it's making sure that that's robust and the right people are involved. So we got our temporary works team involved, our health and safety team, the subcontractor that was going to be installing the beams, the lifting subcontractor, and the bridge beam designer as well, which is a key one, it certainly was at the Rugby scheme. So we started to look at the actual beams themselves.
Just before we get to that
Yeah.
detail about the particular lift you're talking about, you've created this procedure for exceptional lifts. How do you define what an exceptional lift is? Who makes the decision whether something is or isn't?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and it's not the easiest one to answer, because it depends on each scheme. Because you've obviously got your intermediate and your high risk lifts anyway from the British standard. But we sort of looked at this, how can we define that to make sure we can trigger this exceptional, and it's 9 times out of 10 we've said all bridge beam lifts will be, and it's usually to do with several things. So one, the crane driver might not be able to see what they're landing because of the actual where the crane's positioned, which on the Rugby one they couldn't because they were sat behind the abutment. And the big part of it is the interface that's needed to make sure that the actual what we're lifting is landing in the right place, because we've obviously got to make sure that we've got to get these things in the right place. And traditionally people would probably be physically handling those beams into position, which is what we recognised we needed to get away from. So that is the main part of the exceptional. If what makes it exceptional is that there's potentially the need for manoeuvring the object being lifted into place, and therefore there's a high risk of potential injury from entrapment and crushing injuries.
So and who's responsible for making that judgment to use this procedure?
So that is the collective of this initial group of people. So it will be the site team, the safety team, the temporary works team. So it's almost we all do it by agreement, because there's no point one person dictating what's going to happen. We decided this was going to be more of a collaborative approach to it, rather than one person dictating that, because the people may have different ideas. So we've come together and that's why it's so important in collaboration, because that's how things are going to get installed. It's going to be our site engineers and site team supervisors, our subcontractors, operatives on site, and the actual lifting team that are all going to be working together. So it has to start together. Is how we looked at it. And so by that initial meeting of this, to go through this design responsibility matrix, that's where that decision's made. And it's usually you can usually have a good sense that it's going to be the exceptional lift because of what it is, as I say, bridge beam, for example. So we already kind of have an idea that's where we're going to go, but then we discuss it in detail. We look at the bridge beam design as well, because that can have a huge difference in terms of where we go with this. Some bridge beam, as the ones in rugby, were actually, when we looked at it, were actually impossible to install because there was that many shear links on the beams, because the beams were designed to be identical, yet the bridge has got a crossfall and it's also on a cant. Which, so if you've got very closely spaced shear links, you physically can't slide the beams down next to each other, and that was a big problem. So that's why that example of rugby is really demonstrated that it's key to get the permanent works designer into that talk early on, so we can have that influence, particularly where we're not design and build.
So, is this procedure then triggered whenever there's a bridge beam lift?
Yeah, pretty much.
So you're going to use it
Yeah.
in those situations.
Yes.
In the sort of wider Galliford Try, how would somebody who's responsible deciding whether or not that procedure is used? Is it the project manager or who's responsible? Who's accountable?
So it would be ultimately the project lead's responsibility to make sure that this process is reviewed. So again, you'd have, let's say, if it's a culvert unit or another object to be lifted, it would trigger that anyway through our standard procedures. We have a technical review, pre-start technical review, where sort of we look at the temporary works register because that's a key driver to this, in terms of stability of objects when they're being lifted or when they're being landed. So that would identify that there is a potential that we need to actually do a review of the exceptional lift procedure. So then the project lead would be responsible for making sure that review of this procedure has happened, and that sort of review will either say, actually, no, we don't need to go down this line because actually we've sort of risk assessed this, and we've deemed that this procedure isn't necessary because it's not an exceptional lift. It's actually a fairly basic lift. Or the other way, where actually, we need to go through this process because we can see there's going to be there's a high risk with this lift that we need to work through this process, and that's the way that it works.
Okay, sorry, however, I thought it was important to understand that how this procedure is used in practice and who's responsible. So, in the general case, then you assemble the team that's partly designers, installers, subcontractors, part of your own team. What happens then?
So I'll use the rugby scheme as the example because that was the first time we put it into practice. So it was a kick-off meeting where what are we actually trying to achieve? We work through the risk process of it, and it works quite well in line with the GIRI initiative, which is the Get It Right initiative, which the CITB have rolled out, which we were part of. We've used that to quite a success as well because that basically looks at it looks at kind of a pre-mortem. So you basically what's gone wrong, what could potentially go wrong.
Yeah.
And it's quite a good way of then working back to solve those problems. And then you basically have to do a risk assessment. So we work our way through looking at the issues. We looked at the bridge beam design. Is there issues there that we need to resolve? In the rugby case, there was. So we did a lot of work with the scheme designer to try and redesign those beams as much as we could, to try and remove some of the shears to make it easier and safer and obviously possible to install.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect we worked through. We worked through the key bit to that one was the temporary works that we did. So we came up with an idea of using timber chocks and taglines. So rather than the beams as they land, people have to physically move them and shove them around. We designed some hardwood timber chocks which basically guided the beams from sort of half a metre up in the air, tag lines to drag them sort of longitudinally into position, and then these timber chocks would allow the beams to slide into the position they were prefixed, set out obviously before we did the beam lift. So that basically eliminated any of the need for people to have to physically touch them with entrapment injuries and stuff, and that was the key driver behind it. So that was the real kind of, I guess, the innovation side of it. As well as all the sort of temporary, when they landed, we put a couple of steel cages, steel frames. We had a service gap in this bridge, so we used that gap to create some steel frames that we were able to strap the beams back to. As I said, the edge beams were sort of twice the weight of the internal beams because they were flared, so they were eccentrically heavy. So we had to make sure they were strapped back. We bolted some frames to the structure with some jacks to hold those sort of those elongated sides in place to make the whole thing stable, whilst we then worked on the rest of the bridge build, getting the deck tied and the rest of it. So all that temporary works development was looking at the potential of what could go wrong. So this edge beam could fall off. How do we stop that? And it's all quite basic. It's all quite basic stuff. But it's that thought process and making sure you've got the right people with the right experience around that table having this discussion, and that's what made the rugby scheme a success. The only thing we did have was, because of the amount of steel in those beams, we did have to amend the procedure as we went, which meant that we had to sort of bend the bars on each beam before they were lifted and during the lift as well, which wasn't ideal. So, but unfortunately, the bridge design wasn't ours. It was one that it wasn't a design and build scheme, and the approvals had already gone through CRT and the local authority. So there was a limited amount that we could do to those beams. So, but we fed that back into the designers via the actual beam manufacturers, because they're part of this. That's something I've missed out. Actually, they're a key part of this process as well, so that they can understand how we're going to be lifting it, so they can potentially make any alterations within design parameters, or maybe some shims or anything else that they need to be adding onto those beams during manufacture to make our install that bit easier and that bit safer. So that was the sort of trial. So we got the beams lifted in. We programmed 5 days. We got it done in 4. There was 32 beams, I think, in total that we installed on that structure. So we there was a couple of things that could have been improved on. Again, the design really didn't help that. So we've moved into this structure that we've built at Grantham, which is a new structure on the A1. Smaller bridge, a little bit more straightforward from a beam install. There were TY beams, so they were fairly straightforward, decently spaced out, no shear links, so they're a lot easier. The challenges on this one is we built this bridge in 2 halves, whilst maintaining 4 lanes on the A1 running the whole time. So it was a top-down bridge construction, which in itself was quite interesting. We did the same procedure again, with everyone that we'd done beforehand, but this time we were literally able to not have any interaction with those beams between attaching the lifting chains onto the beams and taking the lifting chains off the beams again. No one actually physically touched those beams between them being lifted off the back of the wagon and detaching the chains once they were landed in place. And again, same procedure. We used tag lines. We installed timber chocks to make sure the beams were all they were in the right place, because obviously we're going to maintain the quality and make sure we're getting things bang on in terms of the engineering side of things. And that was a real success. Again, we saved time on the program because there wasn't this, so it's not in the right place, lift it up, move it a bit, drop it back down. That we knew they were going to be in the right place because we'd preset the timber chocks, and say using tag lines as well to make sure we get longitudinally in place.
So you get them exactly in the right place.
Yep.
But is there any adjustment need with shims or anything to make sure they sit level on the foundation?
On this one we'd already put with the design on this one, they were sat on rubber bearings, so they were already preset at the right level. So again, we knew they were there. They were factory manufactured beams, so we know we've got the quality of those anyway. There was a little bit of tolerance in, as there always is, between the on the bridge beam landing bearings, but we'd preset everything, so we knew we were ready for it before we came, and that was again part of that lift review, was making sure that we were ready to go and everything was there prior to the beams arriving and under full A1 closure as it was.
So this procedure's been proven to be
Yeah.
a success. Was that originally developed at project level, or was it led by some other department in Galliford?
It was led by our what we call CES, Central Engineering Services, which is our temporary works department.
Yes.
They led it, but it was led in conjunction with site, so it's kind of a two-pronged attack really.
And this proven improved process, is that now part of your? Is it an IMS scheme, some integrated management?
It's part of our BMS scheme.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not part of our business management system.
So that's gone through some approval.
Yeah, it's still being sort of tweaked, but it is there. It's integrated. There's always improvements that can be made. There's always things that can be improved on, as there always is when it comes to safety, doing bits and bobs like that.
And finally, you've mentioned the C word a few times, collaboration.
Yes.
As being the root of the success of the implementation of this improved safety procedure. What does collaboration look like in Galliford Try?
I suppose it's the key part of what we do. Really, we if we didn't collaborate, we wouldn't be in existence. In my opinion, I think we have to work with our clients together. We do what we call project charters at the start of each scheme. So we look at sort of a list of behaviours that we expect from each other, which probably sounds a bit cheesy, but it really does work. We get designers involved with that as well, and some of our key supply chain, and we make sure that we want we're going to be working together. Some of these projects go on for 2-3 years, so we need to make sure that we're open and honest with each other, and because sometimes there are going to be difficult conversations to have, be it sort of program related or cost related. So we need to be able to create a culture where we are able to have those conversations, and it is about collaboration, because we have to work together. It's in no one's interests for one party to go off on one line, the other party to go off on the other, because then we end up very much in a position like we were on the scheme we started off talking about, which a lot of us that worked for Galliford Try worked on that scheme, so we know what happens when it goes wrong, and collaboration is a big part of what we do within GT, and it's how we win repeat work with the local authority side that I work on, and the National Highway side of the team as well. We all have to pull in the same direction, because we're all trying to achieve the same goal. So if we don't have collaboration, then it just doesn't work.
James, on that very positive note, thank you very much for coming on the latest episode, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.